What if we told you that the entire history you know about Africa is a faked script created by Europe? Europe made extensive efforts to erase Africa's authentic history, wiping out its golden days to facilitate the onset of slavery. However, the truth cannot be concealed indefinitely. Figures like Cheikh Diop, considered the most disliked man in Europe, played a pivotal role in revealing the authentic narrative. Diop exposed the discrepancies between what historians were compelled to write and the actual reality. In today's video, we will explore precisely this topic. So, let's get started. No matter how hard Europe tried to hide Africa's real history, some scholars did their job by exposing Europe. Even after receiving death threats, they continue to tell the world the truth. And one such legend is Cheikh Diop. Cheikh Diop, a prominent African scholar, played a crucial role in challenging Eurocentric historical narratives and reshaping perspectives on African history. He gave some interviews where he exposed Europe on national TV. In one of his discussions, he highlighted the tasks faced by African scholars in Western academia, emphasizing the need to rewrite histories to affirm a countervailing monolithic African identity for all blacks. This identity, as described by Black psychologist Amos Wilson, serves as an inherently anti-hegemonic protest identity, crucial for challenging Eurocentric narratives. What stereotypical identity was created by Europe about Africa, according to Diop? Europe, particularly during the era of colonialism, has historically perpetuated various stereotypical identities about Africa. These stereotypes were often rooted in Eurocentric biases, ignorance, and a desire to justify colonization and exploitation. Europeans propagated the stereotype that Africa was a continent characterized by primitiveness and backwardness. This perception justified the colonial mission as a civilizing effort, suggesting that European intervention was necessary to bring progress and development to supposedly uncivilized societies. The portrayal of Africans as savages and barbaric people was a common stereotype perpetuated by European colonial powers. Such depictions served to dehumanize African communities and rationalize the brutal treatment they endured during colonization. European narratives prevalently romanticized Africa as an exotic and mystical land. This stereotype often portrayed Africa as an untamed wilderness, focusing on exotic wildlife, tribal rituals, and a perceived lack of modernity. Europeans often portrayed Africa as a monolithic and homogeneous entity, neglecting its diverse cultures, languages, and histories. This oversimplification reinforced a narrow understanding of the continent, overlooking the complexity and richness of its various societies. The stereotype of Africans as helpless and dependent perpetuated the narrative that they needed European guidance and intervention for their welfare. This justification was used to rationalize colonization and the imposition of European systems and values. Colonial narratives propagated the idea that Africa lacked significant civilizations and histories. This historical erasure was a deliberate strategy to undermine the achievements of African societies and legitimize the exploitation of the continent's resources. Europeans propagated stereotypes suggesting inferior intellectual abilities among Africans. This false narrative was used to justify discriminatory policies and practices, reinforcing racial hierarchies that positioned Africans as inherently less intelligent. Africa was often portrayed as a continent plagued by disease and danger. This stereotype served to justify European control over African territories by framing colonial rule as a necessary means of protecting European settlers from perceived threats. Sensationalized tales of cannibalism and fetishism were spread to dehumanize Africans and depict them as primitive and uncivilized. Such narratives were often based on cultural misunderstandings and biased interpretations. But what was African history? And what was the one portrayed by Europe? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Africa's history is filled with diverse civilizations, cultures, and contributions that significantly shape the global narrative. Unfortunately, Europe's historical portrayals, often influenced by colonial biases, have perpetuated distorted narratives and Eurocentric perspectives. Africa is home to many ancient civilizations that shaped early human societies. The Kingdom of Kush, Carthage, the Mali Empire, and the Great Zimbabwe are just a few examples. These civilizations were centers of trade, scholarship, and cultural development, contributing to the rich tapestry of African history. However, European portrayals historically downplayed or dismissed these achievements, contributing to the misguided notion that Africa lacked significant civilizations before European contact. This misrepresentation obscured the vibrant histories of African societies. Substantial contributions to global civilization mark Africa's real history. Ancient Egypt, a cornerstone of African civilization, made advancements in mathematics, architecture, medicine, and philosophy. The libraries of Timbuktu in West Africa were renowned centers of learning. Contrastingly, European portrayals often marginalized or ignored Africa's contributions, reinforcing the misconception that significant advancements were exclusive to other parts of the world. This Eurocentric bias diminished the true scope of Africa's impact on world civilization. An extraordinary diversity of cultures, languages, and traditions characterizes Africa's history. Diverse ethnic groups and societies, each with a unique heritage, have shaped the continent's cultural richness, influencing global art, music, dance, and literature. However, Eurocentric narratives tended to oversimplify Africa into a monolithic entity, neglecting the intricacies of its diverse cultures. Stereotypes perpetuated the idea of a homogeneous Africa, further distorting the continent's true cultural mosaic. Africa historically possessed thriving economic systems, evidenced by sophisticated trade networks, advanced agricultural practices, and skilled craftsmanship. Trans-Saharan trade routes connected West Africa to the Mediterranean, facilitating economic prosperity. Yet, European portrayals occasionally depicted Africa as economically underdeveloped, reinforcing that European intervention was necessary for economic progress. This oversimplification disregarded the continent's intricate economic structures. African scholars and intellectuals have made significant contributions throughout history. The libraries of Timbuktu were not only centers of learning, but also repositories of scientific knowledge and literary achievements. These intellectual pursuits challenged Eurocentric notions. However, Eurocentric portrayals perpetuated stereotypes suggesting inferior intellectual abilities among Africans. This false narrative contributed to the misrepresentation of Africa as a continent lacking intellectual achievements. Africa's real history includes a legacy of resistance against colonial rule. Numerous independence movements, driven by the quest for self-determination, led to the decolonization of the continent in the 20th century. Visionary leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Nelson Mandela spearheaded these movements. Despite these significant historical events, European portrayals often downplayed or ignored the resistance efforts. The narrative frequently emphasized the supposed benevolence of colonial powers, overshadowing the struggles for independence. Africa's history extends to contemporary times, with the continent making substantial contributions to various fields. Africans continue to shape the global landscape in science, technology, literature, and the arts. Dynamic societies and innovative individuals are driving progress across diverse domains. Yet, outdated stereotypes may persist, hindering a comprehensive understanding of Africa's contemporary achievements and potential. Efforts to challenge these misrepresentations are essential for fostering a more accurate and inclusive global perspective on Africa. So, the disparity between Africa's real history and European portrayals reflects the lasting impact of historical biases. How did Europe make the reality disappear and make people believe its prototype is the real truth? Europe's historical dominance and imperialistic pursuits were pivotal in shaping a Eurocentric narrative obscuring rich African history. The mechanisms through which Europe made reality disappear and propagated its prototype as the truth are shocking. First, colonial control of education. During the era of imperialism, European colonial powers wielded control over education in African territories. The curriculum was tailored to highlight European achievements while downplaying or omitting Africa's contributions to world history. This deliberate manipulation of educational content perpetuated Eurocentric biases among both colonizers and the colonized. Second, cultural hegemony through media. The media became a powerful tool for perpetuating Eurocentric narratives. European media outlets framed stories and images to reinforce stereotypes about Africa, depicting the continent as primitive, backward, and in need of European intervention. This biased portrayal further solidified the notion of European superiority. Third, pseudoscientific theories. Europe promoted pseudoscientific theories, such as the Hamitic hypothesis, to legitimize its distorted view of African history. These theories suggested that certain African civilizations' achievements resulted from external, non-African influences, reinforcing the idea of European cultural and intellectual superiority. The scientific veneer lent credibility to these unfounded claims. Fourth, suppression of indigenous narratives. Indigenous African narratives, oral traditions, and historical records were often disregarded or suppressed by colonial powers. European explorers and scholars dismissed local accounts as myths or folklore. This erasure of indigenous perspectives deprived Africa of its voice in shaping its history. 5. Selective memory in historical records. European historians and chroniclers selectively recorded and emphasized events that supported the Eurocentric narrative. African civilizations' achievements, scientific advancements, and cultural contributions were often marginalized or ignored. This selective memory reinforced the perception of Africa as a passive participant in world history. 6. Racial hierarchies and justification for exploitation. The construction of racial hierarchies served to justify European colonization and exploitation of African resources. Europeans propagated the idea of racial superiority, positioning themselves as more advanced and capable of leading lesser civilizations. This justification provided a moral framework for the exploitation and subjugation of African societies. 7th, economic exploitation and dependency. Colonial powers exploited Africa economically, extracting resources without equitable compensation. This economic exploitation perpetuated the narrative that Africa was economically underdeveloped and in need of European intervention for progress. The reality of vibrant pre-colonial economic systems was conveniently overlooked. 8. Reinforcement through art and literature. European art and literature often depicted Africa through a lens that reinforced prevailing stereotypes. Colonial-era literature, for example, depicted Africa as the dark continent needing enlightenment, further entrenching the Eurocentric view of Africa as a continent devoid of sophistication. 9th, the legacy of systemic racism. The legacy of colonialism and the establishment of systemic racism contributed to the endurance of Eurocentric perspectives. Post-colonial institutions and structures often perpetuated the existing biases, hindering efforts to present a more accurate and inclusive representation of African history. What did Europe get by removing real African history? The Eurocentric suppression of African history served various purposes for Europe, aligning with the colonial and imperialistic agendas of the time. By erasing or distorting Africa's rich history, Europe sought to justify its colonization. A fabricated narrative of Africa as a primitive and uncivilized land provided a moral pretext for European powers to assert control, arguing that they were bringing civilization and progress to a supposedly inferior society. The Eurocentric narrative perpetuated racial hierarchies, positioning Europeans as racially superior and Africans as inferior. This ideological framework not only justified colonization, but also served to maintain social and racial dominance. It provided a pseudoscientific basis for discriminatory practices, reinforcing the belief in European racial superiority. The distorted narrative of Africa as underdeveloped and without significant contributions to civilization facilitated economic exploitation. European powers engaged in resource extraction without equitable compensation, benefiting from Africa's natural resource wealth. This economic exploitation was enabled by portraying Africa as a continent needing external guidance and intervention. By suppressing the true history of Africa, Europe sought to maintain control over indigenous populations. A distorted historical narrative contributed to the construction of an image of Africans as passive recipients of European enlightenment. This perception facilitated the imposition of colonial rule, as Europeans justified their authority by portraying themselves as superior and more advanced. The Eurocentric narrative aimed to impose European cultural hegemony by downplaying or disregarding the rich cultural heritage of African societies. This cultural suppression weakened local identities, making it easier for Europeans to enforce their cultural norms, values, and institutions on the colonized populations. The Eurocentric narrative contributed to the division and manipulation of indigenous African societies. By undermining a sense of shared history and cultural pride, European powers exploited existing ethnic and tribal differences. This division facilitated the implementation of the divide and rule strategy, undermining unity and resistance against colonial rule. The distorted portrayal of Africa in Eurocentric narratives perpetuated stereotypes and prejudices that persist to this day. Africans were often depicted as primitive, exotic, or inherently inferior, reinforcing discriminatory attitudes and justifying unequal treatment. These stereotypes impacted how Africa and its people were perceived globally. During the era of transatlantic slavery, a distorted view of Africa justified the dehumanization and enslavement of millions of Africans. Portraying Africans as uncivilized and inferior provided a moral justification for the brutal exploitation of human lives, allowing Europeans to reconcile the contradiction between their actions and ethical considerations. Europe's removal and distortion of African real history served as a tool for justifying and perpetuating colonial rule, economic exploitation, and the enforcement of Eurocentric ideologies by shaping a narrative that undermined African society's agency, contributions, and identity. European powers aimed to consolidate their control and advance their imperialistic agendas on the continent. How did Diop contribute to telling the real African history to the world? Cheikh Anta Diop made groundbreaking contributions to telling the real African history, challenging Eurocentric narratives and presenting a more accurate representation of Africa's rich and diverse past. Diop vehemently rejected the Hamitic hypothesis, a Eurocentric theory suggesting that advanced African civilizations, particularly ancient Egypt, resulted from a Caucasian or Hamitic influence. Diop's work, including his groundbreaking book, The African Origin of Civilization, dismantled this unfounded theory, asserting the indigenous African origins and contributions to these civilizations. One of Diop's major contributions was his affirmation of the Negroid character of ancient Egyptians. Through meticulous analysis of physical anthropology, linguistics, and archaeological evidence, he argued that the ancient Egyptians belonged to the Negroid racial group. This starkly contrasted with prevailing Eurocentric views that sought to downplay Africa's role in developing civilization. Diop's unique approach involved integrating scientific disciplines, including physics, anthropology, linguistics, and history. As a physicist, he applied scientific methods, such as radiocarbon dating, to his historical and anthropological research. This multidisciplinary approach added credibility to his work and challenged the pseudoscientific foundations of Eurocentric theories. Diop emphasized the importance of a unified African identity, transcending colonial-imposed divisions. He drew inspiration from the Negritude movement and advocated for celebrating and promoting African culture, heritage, and identity. By fostering a sense of pride and unity, Diop aimed to counteract the divisive impact of Eurocentric narratives. Diop stressed the significance of reclaiming ancient Egypt as part of Africa's historical legacy. He highlighted the profound influence of ancient Egyptian civilization on world history, particularly its contributions to classical Greece. This perspective aimed to correct historical distortions and underscore Africa's integral role in shaping human civilization. Recognizing the importance of education in shaping historical perceptions, Diop advocated for educational reforms. He called for integrating African history and civilization into mainstream curricula, challenging the Eurocentric biases present in educational systems. Diop sought to empower future generations with a more inclusive and accurate understanding of Africa's contributions. Beyond academia, Diop was actively involved in politics, contributing to the struggle for Senegal's independence. His political engagement aimed to create an environment conducive to redefining Africa's historical place and challenging the neo-colonial structures perpetuating Eurocentric ideologies. Cheikh Diop's work laid the foundation for Afrocentrism, a movement that seeks to center African perspectives and challenge Eurocentric dominance in historical discourse. Scholars and activists continue to draw inspiration from Diop's contributions, fostering ongoing efforts to tell the real African history and counteract historical distortions. What can be done by Africans to make sure the world knows the truth about African history? As Africa continues to strengthen its position on the global stage and make progress in various fields, the likelihood of allowing the truth to be hidden diminishes. As African nations achieve economic growth and political stability, they gain more influence and agency on the international platform. With increased autonomy, there is a greater opportunity to shape global narratives about Africa and challenge historical distortions. The rapid development of technology has provided Africans with powerful tools to share information and control their narratives. Social media, digital platforms, and online spaces enable Africans to disseminate accurate historical information globally, reducing the likelihood of the truth being hidden. Many African countries prioritize educational reforms to present a more accurate and inclusive portrayal of their history. By incorporating diverse perspectives, highlighting achievements, and dispelling stereotypes, the younger generation is better equipped to contribute to a truthful representation of Africa's past. A resurgence of pride in African culture and heritage is underway, driven by various cultural movements, festivals, and artistic expressions. This cultural renaissance fosters a positive self-image and encourages Africans to actively contribute to shaping global perceptions of their history. African nations are increasingly engaging in collaborative efforts with international organizations, institutions, and partners. These collaborations facilitate a more nuanced and accurate understanding of African history on a global scale, as shared initiatives can challenge outdated narratives. Grassroots movements and activism are crucial in challenging misrepresentations of African history. As awareness grows and communities actively advocate for accurate narratives, the pressure on governments and institutions to promote the truth increases. African nations are utilizing cultural diplomacy to project a positive image globally. Engaging in cultural exchanges, artistic collaborations, and international events allows African countries to showcase their rich history, diversity, and contributions to humanity. The African academic community conducts rigorous research to uncover and disseminate accurate historical information. Scholars and historians are vital in challenging Eurocentric perspectives and contributing to a more comprehensive understanding of Africa's past. As global awareness of historical distortions grows, there is an increasing global solidarity with African nations in their efforts to present an accurate narrative. The international community is becoming more receptive to diverse perspectives and challenging outdated stereotypes. But why did all this get revealed? The truth, by its very nature, tends to surface eventually. Attempts to conceal or distort it may be successful temporarily, but truth has a resilient quality that often prevails in the grand scheme of things. Whether through the efforts of dedicated scholars, the evolution of societal consciousness, or advancements in information accessibility, the truth tends to find its way into the light. While there may be challenges and obstacles in the short term, the truth has a persistent and undeniable force that cannot be suppressed indefinitely. The truth about African history is a poignant example of how hidden or distorted narratives can be brought to light. Scholars, historians, and activists have worked tirelessly to uncover and share the authentic history of Africa, challenging Eurocentric perspectives that sought to marginalize or misrepresent the continent. Through academic research, advocacy, and a collective effort to reclaim narratives, the truth about African history has gradually emerged, providing a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the continent's past. This ongoing process highlights the resilience of truth and the potential for positive change when individuals and communities are committed to revealing and acknowledging historical realities. Do you think African history can be kept hidden? Will Europe's fake story about Africa work? Let us know in the comment section. Did you know the reality of Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.